I am Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. Spooky season is in full swing with pumpkins grinning from every shop window and autumn leaves drifting the pavements. And despite the dark and chilly mornings, I can't help but love this time of year. It ever gladdens and brings a crooked smile to my little Halloween-shaped heart. And we've got just the thing to get you in the mood for this, the most wonderful time of the year. Fitz, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
Coming up this episode, we have an absolutely fascinating interview with paranormal author Ruth Roper Wylde, who was kind enough to sit down and talk all things ghosts with us, as we got thoroughly carried away, really getting under the skin of all things paranormal and discussing our thoughts and theories on everything from anniversary hauntings to Black Shucks and quite a lot in between. We've got listener stories from Angela, Shelby and Porcha, and we're sticking with the haunted house for sale theme on the Paranormal Radar, and Zak Bagans is looking to buy a brain.
But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to thank our latest patrons.
Jill Drury,
Rabbit Writer,
Serena Hagel,
and thank you also to our patrons who have upped their pledges this month.
Andrew McKeon,
Katrina Alvey,
and thank you also to those of you that have made donations through Coffee this month.
Harper,
and Jamie, and we do hope you're feeling better after your surgery. We also want to apologise that we're a little bit behind on sending mail to some of our patrons. You all know that we've been struggling recently and you've been unendingly understanding and patient, so we just wanted to thank you for that and reassure you that we're on the case, getting caught up, so if you're waiting for mail from us, we'll get it out to you as soon as we can.
We feel so incredibly lucky to have you guys on board with us on this weird and wonderful spooky journey. I know we say every episode that we couldn't do this without you, but it's absolutely true, and we're just honoured that you believe in the show enough to support it. So truly, thank you. Now let's get to the Paranormal Radar. So Fitz, what's pinged the radar today?
Well, I've got a few interesting stories for you this time, and the first is yet another haunted house up for sale. It's not one that I'm aware of being famous in paranormal circles, but it does seem to have some notoriety in the legal field. This particular haunted house is an 1890s Queen Anne Victorian 5-bedroomed home on the Hudson River waterfront in Nyack, New York, and it seems as though there might have been some local folklore about the place being haunted for some time. The Ackley family purchased the property in the 1960s. At that time the home was vacant and in disrepair, and maybe it was just this giving the house a certain spookiness, or maybe something more. But whatever the reason, when the Ackleys moved into the home, they were purportedly warned by local children that it was haunted. By the 1970s, Helen Ackley was confirming to the media that the house was indeed haunted, and came forward with stories published in the Reader's Digest and several local newspapers telling of the poltergeists that haunted their home, with her reports including beds being shaken, phantom footsteps, slamming doors, objects disappearing, and others they had never seen before appearing from nowhere, conversations coming from vacant rooms, and experiences of witnessing full-bodied apparitions. Helen Ackley never claimed to be terrorised by the unusual activity, and in fact reported that the family had a peaceful coexistence with the resident spirits. But the stories being published in the media gained the house some local notoriety, and it was soon included on a walking tour of the area. Come the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Ackleys decided to put the home on the market, and prospective buyer Jeffrey Stambovsky knew nothing of the reported hauntings, until after he'd entered into a contract to buy the home with a down payment of $32,500. The house then became the centre of a highly unusual legal case, as Stambovsky took the Ackleys to court for failing to notify him of the reported hauntings. It was a complicated case, with one side arguing that a haunting wasn't a condition that could be ascertained, and the other claiming that having publicly announced the hauntings in the media, the family couldn't deny knowledge of the haunting, and that the stories would have reputational consequences whether the haunting was real or not. The legal back and forth that went on is honestly beyond me, but the upshot was that Stambovsky was allowed to back out of the contract. The house was deemed legally haunted, and the outcome of the case became known as the Ghostbusters ruling. Apparently, the next occupants of the home weren't bothered by any paranormal activity, and nobody living at the property since has come forward with tales of any spooky occurrences. And despite the concerns about the property being declared legally haunted, it doesn't seem to have done the market value much harm, as it's currently listed at $1.9 million. It is a lovely looking house and on the waterfront too, so if you want to help stump up $1.9 million so that we can move in and do an investigation for you, then do let us know.
It's not cheap, is it? 1.9 million.
It is a lot of money, isn't it?
I hope it has a pool for that kind of price.
I can't remember if it does, but you've got a lake or river running right next to it, so...
Well, yeah, I think I'd want a pool as well, and, several garages, and it just seems like an exorbitant amount of money.
Listen to Little Miss, it's not good enough for me.
For that price. But yes, I would love to investigate there and see if there's any truth to the claims. It's an odd one, and it's not something we have over here in England. There is no law over here that says you have to declare any kind of haunting. There's nothing in the law over here about
not
ghosts
as far as I'm
hauntings.
aware. I mean, interestingly enough, it was something that was brought up on Haunted Connections on Parasearch Radio that we were on recently with Neil and Jane of the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre.
Yeah, I don't know whether it was related to this story being in the media or not. They didn't say so, but it was just one of the things that they asked us was, especially because we've lived in a haunted house before, do we think that if you're selling a house and you are aware that it's haunted, you should have to legally declare that? It's actually a really hard question.
Yeah, it pretty much covered the ground that was in the legal case here. It's like, if it is haunted, how do you demonstrate it? And if it's not, and then you've got the reputational issue of it.
But the thing that I kind of got stuck on was, as seems to be the case in this instance as well, obviously this one family had a lot of activity there, and the next family that moved in, apparently nothing. And we know ourselves, it can go like that for, even at the same time, during the same time period, you can have different people going into the same property, and some of them will experience quite a lot of activity.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them will experience absolutely nothing and be blissfully unaware of anything going on. And certainly with different families moving in and out of houses, you could have a string of 3 families moving into one place, all of them having experiences, and then all of a sudden something changes, and whatever that thing is, the next family that moves in isn't experiencing anything. So it's not, I don't feel like it's a fixed thing. You can have a haunted house that is then becomes not haunted,
mm-hmm.
and then it starts again. How could you possibly measure that in a way that it could be sort of legally
binding?
Yeah. It was a tough one, but a really interesting concept. Well, moving on from haunted houses, I believe you've got something else on the radar about that rascally Zak Bagans.
Yes, he has set off the paranormal radar again this month.
Oh dear, what now?
Well, he does quite often make appearances on the paranormal radar for his purchases of haunted homes and items, but this time he's got something really unusual on his shopping list. He's decided that he wants to buy a brain.
I could say something really quite derogatory there. I won't. Carry on.
Zak recently visited the home of Dr. Helen Morrison, a forensic psychiatrist who currently owns the preserved brain of serial killer John Wayne Gacy, infamously known as the Killer Clown. And we know how much you love killer clowns.
Yes.
On handling the brain, and who does that?
Oh, yeah.
For a start, but on handling the brain, Zak professed that he could sense pure evil. And this on top of Dr. Morrison's claim that she senses the spirit of the serial killer following her, prompted him to attempt to buy the brain for his haunted museum. Fortunately, as far as I'm concerned, Dr. Morrison refused to sell it. Personally, it's a step too far for me and makes me wonder what on earth he's going to try and buy next.
Yeah, I think that's a bit too far for me as well. So I'm just going to say, ugh, and leave it there. But I have a story to bring to the Paranormal Radar today as well, on my very favourite subject, creepy dolls. You all know how much I love them. Not. The History Centre of Olmsted County in Rochester, Minnesota, thought that some of the items in its collections weren't getting a lot of love and attention of late, so they decided to employ their items' best assets and take to social media to get them the attention they rightly deserved. And what all these items had in common is that they are all as creepy as hell. Every day between the 16th and 24th of October, they posted a new picture of one of the museum's dolls, asking people to vote for which they thought was the creepiest by liking the pictures. Of course, it's a very clever and seasonal marketing idea, but that doesn't make the dolls any less terrifying to look at. There's a weird, bendy-leggedy clown jester thing. There's one that just looks like she's plotting to kill you. One who's showing the whites of her eyes. Oh, trust me, there is plenty of nightmare fuel there for you. So if you do have a pressing desire to not sleep for days, just pop on over to their Facebook page to check out the photos and find out who was voted the winner. And if you live in the area, then there's even better news, possibly. All of the creepiest doll competition contestants will be on display in a special exhibit at the museum from October the 29th to December the 1st. And if you do want to head down, of course, we will put that story in the show notes for you.
I, however, will pass.
It is worth popping over and looking at the photos, though. Some of them are quite spectacular.
Yeah, we'll put links to all the stories in the show notes, so do go check them out and let us know what you think.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get stuck into our first listener story, this month we got what I think is our first ever piece of fan art.
I know, I was so excited.
Alice Bergham has recently started listening to the show with her mum Elizabeth and her sister Mary, who I believe is also our youngest listener at 4. Alice drew the story of the man all the way back from episode 1, and you can check out the picture on our Facebook group, if you dare.
It made me so happy getting our first piece of fan art. I think that's one of our greatest achievements. But now, settle in, dim the lights, grab a blanket, and set your pumpkins a-glowing. It's time for some ghost stories.
And our first story this month is from Angela.
This paranormal experience was related to me by my brother, who personally experienced some of these ghostly instances, whilst others were told by his co-workers who experienced equally haunting experiences. This story goes back approximately 15 years and occurred in a 100-year-old Victorian mansion that was turned into a business office in a suburb of Los Angeles. The mansion had 4 floors, a basement, a main floor, a 3rd floor with 6 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, and a 4th floor that previously served as an attic, but now had a few small rooms and a 4th floor bathroom. The occurrences took place on all floors, and each of the staff had their own experiences while working there. All the bedrooms were used as offices, which accommodated 1 or 2 workers. Along the walls on the 2nd floor were large bookcases filled with books. One evening, my brother was working on a deadline and had to work late into the night. His door was closed, and he was the only one in that room, or in the house for that matter. All of a sudden, he heard these loud thuds in succession, as if someone was throwing down each of the bookcases with all of the books crashing to the floor. My brother came rushing out of his office, but everything was oddly intact, as if nothing had happened. This would occur a couple more times before my brother had had enough and rushed out of the building. On another evening, he found himself working late once again. At the bottom of the stairs, there happened to be a motion detector that looked like a frog. Whenever anybody passed the motion detector, the frog would say, "Ribbit." This was placed near the foot of the stairs by one of my brother's co-workers because they thought it was funny and cute. While my brother was working upstairs, he heard the frog say, "Ribbit." My brother ran out and shouted downstairs, thinking that one of his co-workers had returned to work, but no one replied. He went back into his office to continue working, but once again he heard the frog say, "Ribbit," and then repeatedly, over and over. Finally, he ran downstairs and removed the batteries from the motion detector. The next day, he related his experience to a couple of his co-workers. They decided to test the motion detector to determine if it was just faulty. First, they walked past the frog, which elicited a ribbit. They did this a number of times to verify, and each time it worked accordingly. Then they rolled a small ball in front of the frog, and nothing happened. They tried passing other light objects in front of the frog, which garnered no response. It was only when somebody walked in front of the frog did the motion detector make a sound. Another co-worker happened to work late one evening and reported that she heard someone walking up and down the stairs, but every time she ventured out of her office, no one was there. She thought perhaps that she was just imagining the heavy footsteps and attributed it to just being tired. However, shortly after, someone happened to whisper her name in one ear, and when she turned her head, the masculine voice whispered her name in her other ear. After that, she had had enough and left the mansion right away. Due to the shortage of storage areas upstairs, all of the bulk office supplies were kept in the downstairs basement. The basement was large, dark and cold, and contained only 2 small wall lights for the entire area. Suffice to say that it was the creepiest part of the house was an understatement. Whenever anyone ventured down its stairs, an immediate, heavy feeling could be felt, along with the sensation that you were not alone. At times, the 2 light bulbs that provided light would either flicker at the same time or flicker one after the other, and sometimes would turn off completely on their own. The bulbs had been replaced multiple times, and an electrician had verified that there weren't any problems with the wiring. One evening, the group decided to get some dinner after work and planned to carpool to the restaurant. The last of the co-workers had forgotten something in her office and needed to go and retrieve it. Her office had been on the 4th floor, and after getting what she needed, she decided to use the restroom before leaving. While washing her hands, she had this odd feeling that someone was standing behind her, and when she looked up and looked at the mirror, she could see the shower curtains behind her move as if someone was hiding behind them. But when she moved the curtains back, there was no one there. The window in the bathroom was completely shut, so there was no breeze to move the curtain. Feeling spooked, she wanted to leave immediately, but when she turned the doorknob to let herself out, the door appeared to be locked from the outside. At this point, she was getting very anxious because the door wouldn't budge no matter how much effort she used, and the lock was on the inside. Finally, one of her co-workers got concerned that she was taking a while and ran upstairs to find her. She was shouting frantically that she was locked in the bathroom, yet her co-worker was able to turn the doorknob with ease to let her out. Some of the rooms in the mansion were being renovated to accommodate additional employees. A construction worker had discovered children's toys hidden in one of the walls as he was trying to pull cable. He found it odd that anyone would place toys in a wall, but didn't give it a second thought thereafter. After painting the room, the construction worker left for lunch, but when he returned, he was amazed to see child's footprints stamped all over the walls, the ceilings, and the floor, as if a child just walked barefooted over the wet paint, unaffected by gravity. One day, all personnel were congregated on the 1st floor for a staff meeting. As the director began talking, he was interrupted by the sound of what appeared to be heavy walking from someone with either a peg leg or who was using a cane. Additionally, the staff heard the sound of someone running and jumping hard on the floorboards up above. These 2 supernatural occurrences prompted each of the staff to report their paranormal experience to their director, who was finally of the opinion that a new office location might be the answer for his employees' concern for their own well-being. Within a few weeks, the company was acquired by a competitor, and a decision was made to vacate the mansion and join their new colleagues at the new company's headquarters. My brother and a few of his co-workers were curious as to the history of the home and contacted City Hall. It turned out that the mansion was once a private home, and years later it was converted to a small hotel and brothel where several deaths had been recorded. This was also verified by one of the local university's paranormal department, who informed my brother that he was not the first to report paranormal activity, and that the paranormal team had been called out 3 times in the last 10 years to investigate and hopefully rid the home of its ghostly tenants. After all the furniture and office belongings were moved out, my brother and his fellow co-workers returned one evening with a Ouija board, determined to communicate with the mansion's ghosts. They were able to communicate with a male ghost by the name of John, who confirmed that he had died in the house when it served as a brothel in a fight with another patron. He also confirmed that he was not alone. Before they could extract additional information, the group encountered another spirit who seemed darker and not as forthcoming. This particular spirit seemed so malevolent that the group decided to discontinue their session and not communicate any farther. Eventually, the property was sold to a family who planned to turn it into a family home. Whether or not the real estate agent was aware of or disclosed any of the reported hauntings is unknown, but this experience certainly confirmed my brother's belief in the paranormal.
And thank you, Angela, for getting in touch with that story. It's funny that you should say at the end of that about disclosing whether or not the house was haunted to the real estate agent, bearing in mind the story we had on the Paranormal Radar earlier.
And that wasn't planned either when I put the stories in for this episode. It's just the way these things turn out sometimes, where we end up with this theme, and it is something that's been just cropping up a lot recently.
It was an amazing story, and there was loads of activity, some of which really hit quite close to home. I think one of the earliest parts when you were talking about where your brother heard what sounded like bookcases being thrown over, and yet when he went to check there was nothing that was disturbed. That really sounds so much like our old really crazy spooky house.
Yeah, that really chimed with me as well. And that experience of hearing these loud crashes, like something's fallen over, furniture's fallen over, and then going and finding absolutely nothing out of place. It crops up a lot, not only in contemporary accounts, but also we've found it in a lot of historical stories as well. And we're talking about things from the 1800s and even before that. It's just a common theme that tends to come up in almost more poltergeisty hauntings sometimes.
The other thing that really chimed in with me was the lady that heard her name being whispered in her ear.
We've experienced that as well.
It wasn't my name, but I had something whisper in my ear, again, at this really spooky house that we used to live at. And it really is quite terrifying when you know there's nothing there. Oh, yeah.
No, it's not a pleasant experience at all. But one of the things I loved was the Ribbity Frog. I did love the way they investigated that and tested all kinds of different things with it, because that's the perfect thing to do, you know, by trying to set off the motion detector with all these different things. They have established that it does take quite a lot of movement to set it off. So it's not going to have been set off by a spider or something, you know, an insect flying past it or a light breeze or something like that. It's got to be something substantial for that motion detector to be set off.
Yeah, interesting. We'll have to see if we can get one of those ourselves. I quite want a Ribbity Frog motion detector now.
I do as well. I think it's going on the Christmas list. Well, on to our next story now, and this one is from Shelby.
I would like to share my story about the Farnsworth Inn in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I was there on a ghost road trip with my friend. We'd also gone to Waverly Hills and Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, before ending our journey with a few days in Gettysburg. The Farnsworth Inn is reported to be the most haunted house in Gettysburg. We were staying in the Sarah Black room, and you may have already guessed, it's the most haunted room at the inn. When we checked in, we saw a lot of cars in the lot, so we thought that there were quite a few guests at the house already. We made our way up the side door, for guests only, and through the narrow hallways to our room. When you walk through the house, the wooden floors are very noisy, so we were making quite a bit of noise. You can feel the history when you're in the house. It's amazing. When we were walking to our room, we heard people talking and moving around in the rooms we passed, and commented how it would be nice to talk to them and see what experiences they've had. We found our room at the front of the house, dropped our luggage off, and went back downstairs to explore. We had to walk through the same hallway to get out of the house. It's one way in and out, and didn't hear anyone moving around in the rooms like we had 10 minutes ago. We went down the front staircase and found ourselves in the dining room. We heard a lot of noise in the back towards the kitchen, and all of a sudden heard footsteps coming toward us down a small hallway, except no one was there. We thought it was interesting and continued on our tour. We went back upstairs and down the narrow staircase that leads to the side door. As we were walking back down the stairs, chatting about our plan for the day, the door at the bottom of the stairs started moving very quickly, like someone was trying to come out of the door, and the doorknob started twisting. I told my friend to move quickly because I didn't want to get hit by the door, and as soon as I'd passed it, the movement stopped. We thought that it was very strange. We went back to the registration desk and asked about a map to the battlefield, and asked how many people were going to be staying in the house. She said that no other guests were on the list to be staying at the house for the next few days, except for us. That really piqued our interest. I told her about the experiences we'd just had, and she said that the door moving and hearing people walk around is a common thing to happen in the house. She radioed housekeeping to double check that we were the only people there, and they confirmed that we were, and the staff wasn't even in the inn. We were ecstatic that we'd just had a few experiences. When we slept in the Sarah Black room that night, I kept seeing a little boy peek out of our bathroom. It was very unnerving. There was a boy that had been trampled by a horse and buggy in the street right in front of the inn, and he was taken to our room to be cared for, and he ended up dying due to his injuries. It didn't bother me that I kept seeing him. It was a little alarming though. I'm going back to Gettysburg this fall and can't wait to see what happens.
Thank you so much, Shelby, for sharing that story with us. But most of all, Shelby, I am mega jealous of your haunted road trip and I want to go on it. I mean, Gettysburg, Waverly Hills, Trans-Allegheny, it just sounds amazing.
Yeah, they are all on the list of places that we really want to visit at some point.
And also now, so is the Farnsworth Inn, which sounds like the most incredible place. I really want to go there and check that out.
Yeah, me too. It sounds really active, and I'm really it's a shame you couldn't hear what the people in the rooms were saying. I'd be really interested to know what it was they were talking about.
Well, yeah, because then you might be able to actually place them in maybe even a period of history. But again, that is something that I think we've both experienced ourselves as well. That kind of hearing a conversation in the distance, but not being able to make out what it is. And that's something that's purported quite a lot in the paranormal. The sound of a conversation coming from a room that is known to be empty. But most of the time you can't pick out, or the witness cannot pick out actually what's being said. Just the kind of the low rumble of voices, so you know it's speaking, but you just don't know what's being said.
Yeah, it's interesting that it seemed to happen in pretty much all the rooms as well.
Yeah.
And we've got sort of the walking about that. Do you know what? That actually sounds quite homely to me.
It does sound like quite a nice haunting, just like everybody's going about their business and it's a busy place, and even when it's empty, the activity never really the hubbub never really dies down.
I find it quite easy to relax when sort of stuff is going on around me, and I find that quite welcoming.
Yeah, I think that kind of activity is a nice thought to have.
I'm not sure about the little boy peeking out the bathroom in the middle of the night. That would not be something that would relax me.
That's a little bit more disturbing, just saying. Thank you so much to Shelby again for sharing that wonderful experience with us. And whilst we're on the subject of haunted inns and hostelries, we have a quick announcement for you.
Saloon Media are creating an exciting new paranormal documentary series, and they're looking for people with paranormal experiences to feature on the show. Have you had a frightening encounter with the paranormal whilst working or staying at a hotel? If so, Saloon Media wants to hear your story. Saloon is currently producing Season 1 of Hotel Paranormal, an exciting new documentary series that relies on witness accounts of the supernatural activity that occurs within hotels, B&Bs, inns, etc. throughout North America and the UK. If you're open to sharing your experience on camera, please contact us at contact@knockOnceForYes.com with the chilling details. Please put Hotel Paranormal in the subject line of your email and your contact details along with your story.
Well, I've got to say, we are both rather looking forward to that TV series coming out, because that's just the kind of thing we love to watch.
It is indeed, and if any of you do get featured on the show, let us know so we can make sure to watch out for you.
That would be so exciting. We'd be sitting there in our living room waving at the TV.
Well, it's time now for our next listener story, and this one is from Porcha.
I live in Scotland in a town called Clydebank that was famous for being bombed during the Blitz in the Second World War. I've lived in and around this area for over 35 years and had a number of paranormal experiences. I've kind of got used to it because my grandmother, mother and sisters all have a kind of second sight gift to varying degrees and have had a number of experiences I can't explain. And I thought you may like to hear this experience I had one evening on my way home from work in 1997. At the time, I lived in a small village called Old Kilpatrick, just outside Clydebank. It's a beautiful green belt scenic place, with the River Clyde running behind it and at the foot of the Old Kilpatrick Hills. There's one main road running through the village, with a couple of pubs, a few shops, an ancient old church and graveyard running along one side of this road. It was a November night, about 7:30 p.m, and I was making my way home from work in Glasgow, where I worked for a big media company. I disembarked the train at the village station, and it was a typically frosty, cold, dark winter's evening as I descended the windy hill into the village and along the main road. There was a mist falling down from the hills, which was a very common occurrence as the village could be very Brigadoon-like in winter. As I walked my familiar route of the main road, the village was eerily quiet, with no one around. It was too cold for local kids to be out playing, and most adults were not long home or not ventured out again after tea. I always tended to walk along the side of the main road opposite the graveyard, as even though I was very familiar with it, in the dark I definitely got the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I normally hurried along past. It usually took me about 12 minutes to walk from the train station to home, so it wasn't too daunting. Anyway, on this particular night as I walked along, the mist was thickening, and as I headed towards my street and was just coming past the church and graveyard, I became aware of a figure up ahead on the side of the street I was walking on. As I got closer, I instantly started to feel uneasy, as it was deadly quiet with no one else around. As I got nearer to the end of the long, high wall I was walking alongside, it looked as if the figure was sitting on the electricity junction box, which stood there next to our local historical attraction called St. Patrick's Well. This was right on the corner of my street where I would turn off the main road, so I had no choice but to walk past it. The nearer I got to the figure, the more uneasy I got, like that fight or flight feeling. I could see it was a young boy, maybe 12 years old, and I wondered why he was just sitting there on such a cold, damp, misty night. I thought he had a hoodie pulled up over his head, but could see he had very sharp, fine features to his face through the greyness of the mist. And he almost looked as if he was in black and white, if that makes sense, like looking at a black and white photo. I was basically only feet away from having to walk past in very close proximity to him when every sense in my body told me to move out to the far edge of the curb right next to the main road, as far away from him as I could get without stepping on the road. As I did so and approached parallel to him, I noticed he was grinning at me, almost mischievously, and his fine, sharp features were almost elfin-like. He had very piercing, almond-shaped eyes, and it wasn't a hoodie, but a flat cap on his head, and a jacket, waistcoat and trousers. And he was sitting up on top of the electrical box with his legs crossed, like a lotus position. As I scurried past, seeing him up close, I realised he was actually floating just above the electrical box, and as I looked, he appeared almost transparent. Then he winked and grinned at me. I was totally spooked by this and hurried past as fast as I could, past St. Patrick's Well, and turned left into my street running. As I got close to the door of my tenement house, I was out of breath, but felt enough distance now to glance back, and there was no one there. I put my key in the door and ran up the stairs to my house, my heart pounding. When my teenage daughters greeted me, they asked what was wrong, as they could see I was very scared. So I relayed the story, and everyone looked out of the window for sight of this strange grey boy in his 1940s clothes. This experience really stayed with me, and when my daughters returned from school a few days later after relaying the story to their local friends, they said, "Mum, Jenna's granny has also seen that grey boy out there near St. Patrick's Well in the early hours of the morning, when no one's around, and says he has a very mischievous grin." We lived in the village for 9 years, but I never caught another glimpse of him. Very strange indeed. It has stayed clearly in my memory for all these years, especially how the experience felt and how all my senses were alerting me to his presence, and how unworldly the overall experience was.
And thank you to Portia for sharing that really creepy Halloween-like story for us.
I just felt like that story is going to stay with me as I do my morning walk to work and my evening walk back to my car on these dark, chilly, misty mornings.
You can tell it really made an impression.
Well, I mean, wouldn't it? It's so terrifying. And I do understand what she means about this visceral reaction to just every hair on your body standing up on end, just knowing that there was something off and wrong about this figure.
Yeah, that was something I was going to mention as well. It was one of the things that really sort of brought this story to me. And I've always been interested by that, because you tend to get that in a lot of instances that are, Bunny is paranormal.
Mm-hmm.
And even when I've talked about Jack and how it was all very comforting for us, but other people that came to the house found it very disturbing.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether it's not necessarily a reaction to something that's bad or malicious or wants to hurt you. It's just your body's reacting to something other.
That is an interesting thought. I do take your point there, because it's almost what we were talking about earlier with the haunted houses. Two people can have completely different experiences of the same event or the same space. And yeah, perhaps it is just another sense, essentially. It's an alert system, but not necessarily to, like you say, something negative, just to something that is different that you don't encounter in everyday life.
Yeah, you think about so many paranormal experiences. It's hearing voices, it's hearing footsteps. It's stuff that's, if it wasn't that nobody was there, would be completely innocuous and it wouldn't bother you at all.
This, however, not an innocuous experience.
Yeah.
That is it's just mind-blowing. But the other thing that stood out to me was the fact that it was near St. Patrick's Well. So I haven't done any sort of research into the history of that, but it sounds like either a sacred site or an ancient site, or a site of historical and local importance. So it's very interesting to me that this paranormal experience has happened on multiple occasions, because you've got a second witness that saw the same thing with real detail, because the second witness saw this same mischievous grin, and it's happening around this sort of potentially ancient site.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's a well, because you often hear that water seems to play a role in
That's true.
paranormal things as well. And yeah, the mischievous grin is a little bit creepy, but it seemed then that obviously whatever it was could see them as well.
Yes.
So it wasn't just that, I'm seeing something that happened,
stone tape theory kind of thing.
Yeah, it was something that could actually perceive what was going on around it.
And interact.
But what I found interesting was that it was black and white.
Yes. Have you experienced seeing paranormal apparitions in black and white?
Yes. And I'm hesitant there because I'm pretty sure I have. And then there's other times when it was really, really dark, so it's difficult to tell.
That was my hesitation as well, because I was trying to think back through the more vivid apparitions I have seen, I have witnessed, whether they were black or white or not. Because I remember as a child having this conversation with my brother, actually, about our ghost black and white is just one of those silly arguments we were having as kids. And he was adamant that they were in full colour, and I was adamant that they were in black and white. And it just reminded me of that. And I suddenly thought, have I actually witnessed that? I know other people have. And I've certainly, thinking back, some of the apparitions I've witnessed seem to have been drained of colour. And I'm not sure whether that counts.
Yeah, I mean, you do tend to find that a lot of these reports are kind of monochromatic. You've got the white ladies and the black monks, and it's always sort of, it's not, well, it was wearing brown trousers and a white shirt. It's like, it was black, or it was white, or it was this. So I don't know whether it's just the lack of definition, or just your brain is struggling enough to interpret what it's seeing without bothering to try and colour it in, or...
I don't know. But then again, we have talked recently actually about how, again, coming back to the same thing we were talking about earlier, different people seeing the same thing or experiencing the same thing in different ways. So we had a case where 3 lads saw the same apparition at the same time, and each of the 3 of them saw it slightly differently. So I wonder whether some people see more colour in their apparitions than other people, or whether it just depends on the time of year, or that's the whole rabbit hole we can go down.
It's stuff that really needs to be looked into by somebody
a good
that
rabbit hole.
knows more about how to look into these things than I do.
But it's an interesting question.
Fascinating. I love that story. Thank you, Portia. And thank you to everyone who so kindly shared their stories with us this episode. It is your stories that make the show. And with that in mind, if you've got a story you'd like to share, please do get in touch through our website at notonceforyes.com. We can't wait to hear from you.
Well, funnily enough, just talking about going down rabbit holes and how much we love getting our teeth into the nitty-gritty of all these ideas and theories about paranormal experiences, we have for you now a fantastic interview with author Ruth Roper Wylde, where we basically sit around and do just that. Chat and really get sort of under the skin of paranormal and what we think all these things are. And we found it so fascinating, and we hope you do too. Lovely listeners, we are here today at Coffee HQ, and we have a very special guest with us today. Author Ruth Roper Wylde is with us at Coffee HQ and has agreed very kindly to sit down with us for a chat about all things paranormal.
I think first things first, you've released 3 books so far, I think?
That's right, yeah.
4th one in the works, which we're very excited about.
In the works, was writing 2 chapters before I came here today.
That's what we like to hear. So the first book of yours that I read was The Ghosts of Marston Vail, and that was recommended to me by a friend. And the thing that struck me about it immediately and made me think straight away, I need to sit down with you and talk about ghosts, was in your prologue. You mentioned how when you tell people about what you write about, they often ask you, do you believe in ghosts then? And the way you kind of responded to that, I found, well, firstly, very similar to Fitz's.
It was almost, I've done a blog post on this, and it was almost identical to what you'd written, which is very much, summing it up in my own words, was something strange is going on. I don't know what it is, and I'm interested to find out, I think is the sort of summation for me. How is it for you? I mean, I know you've said that, like Lil was saying, do you believe in ghosts? It's like, maybe.
It's not as simple as that.
It's not as simple as that.
Perhaps you could just talk about that a little bit.
So my interest in the paranormal probably began from the age of about 5 or 6 years old, when I first experienced something paranormal, and then having lived in a series of 2 different haunted houses, one with what many people would class as a poltergeist, and experiencing quite a few things in those. For me, it's not a case of, do you believe in ghosts? It's a case of, there is a phenomena that occurs, or lots of different phenomena. What's causing it? And it's not as simple an answer as, could it be the spirits of the dead? Could it be people's own minds, something like telekinesis or telepathy or something like that? Could it be angels? Could it be demons? Could it be elementals? When I started reading into it, as I got old enough to actually start to read about the subject, you realise that there are so many different theories out there. And that's when I thought, well, none of those theories quite fit what I've experienced. So for me, none of that gives me a straight answer. That's coupled with my mother had a very, very analytical mind. She was a radio engineer by trade. And she was one of those incredibly sensible people that never took anything at face value. She had to look further into it. So she never reacted hysterically when anything happened, and sort of instilled in us a desire to figure out what had caused it. And then when I went into adulthood and a career, I went into an investigative type career roles. So I was a fraud investigator for 15 odd years, and then a bullying, harassment, discrimination investigator for another 15 years. I'm giving my age away here. So that investigator part of me has obviously been quite well embedded in me over the years. So I'm just always fascinated with, it's not a question of do things happen, of that I'm absolutely certain. It's a question of what's causing it to happen. Is there one cause, one answer, or are there lots and lots of different answers because there's different occurrences? And when I decided I wanted to write books, which was probably at least 20 years ago that I started my database, thinking I'd eventually get round to having time to write the books. The premise that I was working on then was, if somebody sits down and gathers all the data in one place and puts it down for posterity, freshly gathered data, then that might help somebody with probably more brains than I've got figure it out at some point, what's actually causing it. Look for trends, be able to analyse it, be able to link together other people's research and data, and actually find the answer. And that's, to my mind, how most scientific experiments and what have you come about over the centuries, isn't it?
Yeah,
somebody starts gathering data, somebody else gathers data, eventually somebody really special comes along, like an Einstein or whatever, and they're the ones that pull all that data together and are able to actually make some sort of sense out of it and actually find out what's going on. So I'm hoping to be one of those data gatherers that puts it out there, ready for somebody really special to come along and put it all together.
Well, I love the way that the analytical way you think about it, and this kind of drive to gather data. I love the way that's inspired the kind of books that you write, because your first book, Ghosts of Marston Vale, is about a particular area, but the second and third books, the Roadmap of British Ghosts and the Almanac of British Ghosts, are collections. Well, they're just that, they're collections of data. But what made me laugh when the Almanac came out was that when we first started doing this show, I said to Fitz, what we really need is a book that collects all ghost stories that happen on a certain date into one place so I can just look it up. And then lo and behold, you made that book. So just to talk about that particular book quickly now, almanacs. I love a good almanac. I used to work in libraries, so we used to have the Cricketer's Almanac and the Farmer's Almanac, but they've kind of fallen out of fashion now. So was there any particular reason you went for an almanac?
It's really, nobody's ever asked me that question before. So kudos for being the first person to ever ask that. Because on occasion I've regretted calling it the Almanac of British Ghosts.
No, why?
Because so many people say to me, what's an almanac?
Library nerd here.
Yeah. Also started working in a library when I first left school. So it must be something about us library nerds that know what it means. Because to me, it was an obvious word. Mm-hmm. I'm putting together a calendar of when you could go out and find a ghost. So the correct word for that kind of calendar is an almanac.
I guess
So that's what I named it.
they're just not seen.
They're not as common these days.
No.
You don't get almanacs of farming and almanacs of fishing like you
we
used to.
We need to bring back the almanac.
We need to bring back the almanac.
Indeed. I mean, it was perfect for us, Phil was saying, because we do a monthly show. We try and visit location to have a look and investigate it and talk about it on the show. So having a book which basically says, okay, well, it's September, you want to go to so-and-so in September and investigate because you've got more chance of seeing something. Brilliant. Yeah. I don't think we've been to many of the places in there yet, but it is sort of like, it is our Bible for future planning for visits.
Well, there are so many anniversary ghosts, aren't there? And I mean, in the almanac, you've got anniversary ghosts that haunt on a specific date, but you've also got ghosts that are more likely to appear within a certain month rather than on, like the 1st or the 12th of the month. The one that we have been to is Naseby, so that's an anniversary haunting. The problem, I don't know whether you came across any problems with this writing the almanac, but the problem we came across with Naseby, and again, we were going to visit the Fotheringhay Castle and the Talbot, we thought we'd try and tie it in with the anniversary of Mary Queen of Scots beheading. And we thought we were being all clever until we realised that the calendar changed in the 1500s from the
Julian to the
Gregorian.
Yeah.
So with Naseby, we thought we'd be super duper clever and work out what the actual date would have been in the Julian calendar, not in the Gregorian calendar. Unfortunately, it didn't do us any good because nothing really happened. But there is a bit of a conundrum for anniversary ghosts. Are they likely to haunt on if say they haunt on the 14th of July, but it was in the 1400s? Are they going to haunt on the 14th of July now with a different calendar?
That's actually something that when I was writing the book, I very quickly stumbled into.
Yeah.
I got as far as January the 1st. The first entries in the book. And I'm really glad to hear you say that you use it as a reference book for places to go, because that was the whole purpose of writing it.
Mm-hmm.
When I sat down and wrote it, I imagined that it would be used like a reference book, that people could look up the date and think, oh, it's September the 4th, where can I go?
Yeah.
And plan for the next, most likely place to go and investigate. And obviously, as soon as I started to lay it out, because it's an almanac, it goes in calendar sequence, so January, February, March, etc. And as soon as you hit January the 1st and you think, hang on a minute, when I start looking into the history of this anniversary haunting, it's prior to the Gregorian calendar.
Yeah.
So actually, should this be, is it the 6th or 7th of January is the first? I have to look it up every time to remember when the date should be.
I can't even remember which way round it is.
I think the Gregorian's about 2 weeks ahead of the Julian. So if it's 1st of January, it's sort of 15th of January in Gregorian, something like that.
I can never work it out.
Yeah, I always have to look it up every time to work it out, the date in my head. Because you're absolutely right. Theoretically, if you've got a haunting of a battle, or as they quite often are, the eve of battle as well.
Yes, odd that, isn't it?
Yeah. Then theoretically, it ought to be exactly that same day if it's an anniversary haunting every year, regardless of what we mortals
what we call it,
are calling the date. The date should be the same. But then you get into the whole, but actually, calendar is just a construct anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So what meaning does time have when you're talking about phenomena?
Yep.
That's making an assumption, really, that it would fall on exactly the calendar date, that it is definitely the spirits of the dead who therefore knew they were at the Battle of Naseby, for example, and therefore are reenacting it 1 year later. And that just doesn't gel well with me, that would happen anyway.
No.
And one of the things I found when researching Almanac is that actually those that you can find any evidence of current haunting in is never on the actual date.
Oh, right.
It's always around that date.
See, I wonder if it's something like when you have these, like say, not necessarily calendar ghosts, but it's almost like an echo. So it's almost like it's sort of
reverberating.
It's bouncing backwards. So it's never going to be exactly that. I would like to think that if you kind of measured it and plotted it, there'd be some kind of rhythm to it. But it's not necessarily, it's 365 days and then it happens again, and then 365 days and then it happens again.
Because 365 days isn't even the length of a solar year, is it?
No.
That's why we have to have a leap year to correct the calendars, because, we split it into the wrong unit. The actual natural rhythm is a different time by a few hours and minutes than we use. So over a period of centuries, that few hours and minutes would add up, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So actually your date would change.
Quite dramatically, really.
Yeah, over a period of time. But, within that, as well as the ones that are supposed to just haunt, every night each year, you've also got the ones that come back on a cyclical haunting, which there's a couple of them in Almanac. So, for example, Lady Lovibond, the ship that foundered on the Goodwin Sands, just off Kent.
Okay.
And that's supposed to come back every 50 years on the date.
Oh, right, I see.
Now, why 50 years?
Why 50 years?
She didn't make an appearance on the last 50 years, and I think the next one is in, I can't remember, I'd have to look it up, but it's a while ahead. But why 50 years? What on earth would cause a phenomena to circle back round in 50 years, whether it be a ghost, whether it was the spirit of the dead, or whether it was some other kind of natural phenomena? I can't imagine what construct 50 years would have to any kind of phenomena other than a story writer.
Yes.
Which to me brings it back to that's much more likely to be urban myth than anything real behind it. But I still think that even with Almanac, even though at the end of writing that I came to the conclusion that actually there probably isn't really any such a thing as an anniversary haunting, what you get, I think, is a ramp up of phenomena around the time that something happened.
Right, okay.
So if you're talking about a battle or somebody's death date, you're more likely to get a ramp up of phenomena around that month.
Do you think part of that might be to do with because people are thinking about it, people are more aware of it? Like for me personally, when February rolls around, I start thinking about the Talbot and Fotheringhay because I know in my head that that's an anniversary. And there must be lots of people that are aware of certain anniversaries like Naseby, Bosworth, things like that. And that kind of collective, I don't know, consciousness, or maybe more people visiting the site.
Yeah, like us, we went to visit on the anniversary. Yeah. So if we'd have experienced something, would that have been because we went on the anniversary, or would it have been it happens every night at 10 o'clock or something? And if you'd have been there a week earlier, it still would have happened? Or
is it happening because there's more people there
to
ramp the energy levels up?
Yeah, exactly.
This is what endlessly fascinates me, because who knows is the answer to that.
This is what I love about you so much.
You're not afraid to say, we don't know.
Yeah, the one thing that we come across so many times when we're watching like the TV shows and all the sort of things on YouTube is people like, oh, this happened. It is this. It is a 7th level demon, and it's it's blah. It's this. I'm thinking,
how do you know?
There was just a noise. Like, how can you tell that it's this and it came from this and it means this? And I love the fact that in your books it's very much like, I don't know what's happening. I'm literally writing down what the experience is. Move on.
But I think that's the. I mean, if you look at Tyrannosaurus Rex,
you're talking my language now. I'm such a dinosaur now. My little ears pricked up.
For years and years, we drew pictures of Tyrannosaurus Rex standing upright, with his little arms dangling in front, and everybody had all these conversations about what on earth were those arms for? So little, and he's so big, and great big head, and all the rest of it. And he was standing upright, and it was years and years before they realised they'd got the skeleton put together wrong, that they'd drawn the pictures from, and he should actually have been horizontal.
But these things,
so his legs were vertical, but the rest of him was horizontal.
But these things persevere so much in the consciousness of everybody that it's still depicted like that.
Yeah, and that was from an actual physical piece of evidence, a skeleton, that they had incorrectly interpreted the orientation of that skeleton. So how can you possibly make a definitive statement about something's definitive state of being if all you've got to go on is shadow figures or a noise or an EVP, or it's not yet enough data to pull together to give a definitive answer. The only definitive thing you can say about it is something happened and I can't explain what it was. And that's as far as you can go in a definitive statement.
Yeah. And the
at
reality
this point
is,
in time.
Exactly, at this point in time. The reality is that probably within our lifetimes, that question is never going to be answered.
Quite possibly.
There seem to be some fascinating commonalities in a lot of these things, which we've said time and time again on the show. A lot of EVPs that you catch at houses are get out, help, things that you would shout if you heard somebody in your house. So it makes me wonder if a lot of these, I'm going to jump back again because earlier you were speaking about, is it all the same thing? And I think there's lots of different things we're lumping under the term ghost. And they're not necessarily related, only in that we kind of experience them in similar ways. But like with EVPs, I'm wondering whether that's something, we're hearing something that has happened or is yet to happen. And I think perhaps even in some cases, it might be somebody that's hearing an EVP is hearing themselves 6 months down the line when they hear a noise in their house and they go, oh, who's that? Who's there? Get out. And
you've got a little time loop.
Yeah, you've got a little sort of pocket like that. It's very strange.
So the thing that I think about that is not only have you got the variable of what could it be that's being sensed, you've got this thing has happened. You've also got the variable of, we know absolutely scientifically, because I've spent years being an investigator for a living, and you get all sorts of training courses on how to interview witnesses and, deal with evidence and data. If you put 5 people in a room together and you put a phenomena in front of them for, say, 5 seconds, and then you pulled them all out of the room into separate rooms and you interviewed them each separately, you would get 5 different versions of what they just saw or heard, because they will base their understanding and perception of what they saw or heard on their own belief system, upbringing, their own neurological states, whether they've got good eyesight, good hearing, etc., etc., etc. So a dozen variables per person as to how they will interpret what just happened in front of them. So you might get somebody say, I just saw a ghost. I just saw a demon. I just saw an elemental. There was a UFO in the room. There was a fairy in the room. There was a bright flash of light that I have no explanation for in the room. They will each give a different answer if you separate them, depending on so many different variables with that individual. So not only you've got variables of the conditions that you're investigating under, say, you've got the variables of each individual present. And I think that's really noticeable sometimes when you go on an investigation with a group of people and somebody hears a sound and says, did you hear those footsteps? And somebody else says, I didn't think they were footsteps. I thought they were a bang. But you'll very quickly notice in a group that if one person is a bit more forward or a bit more confident than the others, their version will quickly hold sway in the group as to what the group now remembers it heard. So 5 minutes later, everybody will be remembering that it's footsteps they heard. Even though at the moment, they might actually have said, no, hang on, was it? And I think a lot of that comes into this data gathering, that people report differently, even if you've got several people in the same room. When you then separate, perhaps, some of the stories I've got are in the same location, but maybe decades apart. So you've now got even more variables to add into the mix. It just makes it, to me, it makes it even wider and wider, the possible phenomena that could be causing this. But you still have the base fact, yes, there was a phenomena.
Well, that's one of the things I was going to ask you about, actually, with the Roadmap of British Ghosts, which is, well, what it says on the tin, basically. You've collected stories from around Britain that happen on our roads. And I've got to say, this is one of my favourite books just because I find our roads so fascinating. Partly that's because when we go on our spooky adventures, I usually end up as a navigator. So I'm looking at all these weird and wonderful road names and wondering where on earth they came from. And, a lot of our roads are Roman roads still. A lot of our roads cut, when they're not older roads, they often cut through, our local road out of our village cuts through burial mounds, for example. And a lot of places like that, there've been graves disturbed and all sorts. So I just find the whole concept of haunted roads really fascinating, even if that does make me terrified to drive alone at night sometimes.
You and me both.
But one of the things I loved about the Roadmap of British Ghosts is because you've not just sort of collated all the traditional, well-known, historically reported stories. You've also gone out there and got fresh witnesses, and tried to tie, like you were saying earlier, tie all these things together. What was apparent to me was basically just what you were saying. You've got areas where there are, without a shadow of doubt, something is going on there, because you've got stories happening at a particular location that they've been reported for hundreds of years sometimes, and they might start off as a headless horseman or a phantom coach. But, fast forward to modern day, and actually you found that witnesses are still reporting activity at those locations, but it doesn't look like the same thing. It's not a headless horseman anymore, or, sometimes it's strange creatures. One of the ones that particularly stood out to me was the Barford Bridge, because that's quite local to us. And I think we've told this story on the show before, but the legend is that there is a ghostly monk that haunts this stretch of road. And on one night in the 1980s, I believe, a policeman was driving along that stretch of road and looked in his rearview mirror, and this phantom figure was sitting in the back of his car. Now, you actually didn't find a witness that had seen the phantom monk, but you found a witness that had seen something really quite bizarre, something very else. But again, it was the same location. So
was this the lady on the way to a fireworks night party?
That's the one, yes.
And saw something,
a creature,
either a cryptozoid, is that the right word?
Cryptids.
Cryptid, that's the right word, yes. Or an alien, or a demonic figure, however you want to. But yes, something that was not clearly a monk in a black robe.
But what was interesting about that is that the witness actually stated that she wasn't from the area, and she knew nothing about the historical kind of the ghost sightings. She knew nothing about the stories of that stretch of road. And it just struck me what you were just saying about how anybody that experiences a phenomena will apply their own beliefs and experiences and sort of systems to what they're viewing. And I just wonder how much that ties into that particular experience. For example, this lady, she saw this weird creature. But if she had been local and she knew the stories of the area, would she have experienced it differently? Are we kind of experiencing these phenomena differently now just because of our, what we see on TV, for example?
Well, see, this makes me think, because we know that strong electromagnetic fields can make people feel strange, or in some cases see things. Whether there's something in the environment that primes your brain to see something, and then it's your brain that makes up what it is. And if there's folklore that you see a phantom monk, then your brain goes, oh, I've got a weird feeling. Oh, this is that place where people see the phantom monk. Oh, look, there's a phantom monk. Whereas this lady who's not from the area is driving through, her brain's like, oh, something's a bit weird here. And she sees a tree or something moving in the wind, and her brain goes, oh, that looks like some kind of weird creature. I wonder if that could be something that's happening in some of these cases.
But having said that, didn't she have a witness with her that saw exactly the same thing?
Yes, her husband was in the car. And it crossed the road. Trees can't do.
No.
And especially not to two separate, kind of blows my entire argument out of the water there, because you have a corroborating witness that saw exactly the same thing.
But I would counter your argument because you're both assuming that only the witness perception could be changing.
Yeah.
When there is an old quote, and forgive me whoever wrote this because I don't know who it's by, which is that the more you look at the paranormal, the more the paranormal looks back at you.
Yeah.
So who's to say that whatever it is, when all this data ultimately is gathered, and when that brighter person comes along sometime in the future and figures it all out, that the phenomena isn't changing itself in order to appear differently to other people?
That's a very good point. And then that would tie into what we were saying before about how, like with the anniversary ghost, maybe it's fueled by more people visiting the site, and maybe the phenomena is changing. Like you say, it is literally changing, and that is fueled by our expectations, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe. Because we know for certain that we know very little about the human mind. Any brain surgeon will tell you that there's all this masses of cell activity inside the brain that they can measure and look at, but they can't figure out what it's doing half the time. And they don't really know what a lot of it's there for. And for example, fairly recent research, once upon a time, if somebody had a major stroke, that was it. They were pretty much done for. Whereas now they've realised that actually the right rehabilitation, and within a few weeks, that person can very often be up and running around again, because the rest of the body isn't often affected by the stroke. It's only the brain. So all they have to do is reroute the synapses that are dealing with whichever part of the body has taken the hit, and they can actually, have that person up and moving again quite quickly. And if you spend time in a stroke rehab centre and watch the miracles that happen in a few short weeks, now that they know how to get people to reroute the synapses, it just shows you what an untapped wealth there is in the human brain. We really know very little about. So how much of it is an external phenomena? How much of it is an internal phenomena? Better people than I, I'm sure will figure it out. I always just come back to it's the data that's key. Because like you say, for that particular example, what we know for certain is there's an old story about a black monk that haunts that road, is seen down that road. There are a couple of other stories around there of vague dark figures that could then be interpreted as a black monk or whatever, but people have said, well, it was a dark figure. And then there's this one story of the lady and her husband in the car who see this weird 7-foot tall humanoid, naked, hairless creature loping across the road in the headlights of their car, which reacted to the car braking sharply.
Oh, it's giving me chills.
So whatever it was reacting to external stimuli, because when her husband braked sharply because it was loping in front of the car, the front end of the car dipped and it made the noises that a car braking hard will make. And that caused the creature to turn and look at them and then turn and look ahead and carry on. And I hate the way she described it turning slowly, like a robotic head turning very slowly to look at them as it carried loping. Oh, that gave me the creeps even when she was telling me about it. It still does when I read it now. But whatever it was reacting to external stimuli. So is that all within their minds? Because that's an area that causes the human mind to react?
See, this almost reminds me, in a slightly different sense, of people experiencing different things in the same, where was it? Thetford Priory.
Oh, yeah.
I had an experience, and we looked it up when we got back, and somebody else had, and I think he works or writes for the Psychical Research Centre or something.
Yeah, and you didn't know anything about this before. I didn't know anything about it. I had exactly the same experience as him, but also he was there with 3 friends, and they each, which I found fascinating, had different sort of levels of experience. One of them just saw a sort of misty shape. The other one saw what looked like a kind of cloaked figure. And the other one saw in great detail a person in a cloak with like bright red spots, which correlated with a story about someone being stabbed. And I'm just like, they're all seeing the same thing, but they're all coming away with a different vision. And again, it sort of ties into what you were saying previously. But they all seem to be describing the same event in a similar way. And this, I wonder whether it's another one of those things where the people that are seeing a sort of monk are just seeing a more general outline of something. Because anything that's sort of a misty outline will look a little bit like a cloaked figure. Especially if that's what your brain has been primed to expect.
And you always tend to find they're always monks. But then if you think back to, the 1500s or what have you, almost everybody would wear a cloak. Yeah. It would just be, it's a very simple, common item of clothing. So.
Absolutely. The other question that always fascinates me is you get so many headless horsemen, don't you? Headless highwaymen. Yeah. And yet, historically, we almost never beheaded highwaymen. Mm-hmm.
No.
It didn't happen. There were maybe 1 or 2 went dispatched that way. But mostly they were gibbeted or hanged. They weren't beheaded. So where this phenomena of so many beheaded horsemen riding around the country has cropped up from. But actually, when you look into a lot of those stories, they always attribute them to some famous figure, Dick Turpin or Oliver Cromwell riding from out of guilt from the battles. It's always somebody famous. But actually, exactly as you said, for centuries upon centuries upon centuries, everybody rode.
Yes,
everywhere.
It could be anybody.
And they must all, at some point, met a demise or whatever. Why isn't it just Joe Blogg's haunting on his horse? And actually, there's a lovely story in Roadmap of it's just a farmer trundling home in his cart on the way home from the market, and his ghost is said to still haunt. Oh. And I always think, that's probably the most truthful one, because why should it just be the highwaymen that end up haunting? And they're never headless, I'm sure, but but like you say, do people interpret what they're saying because of how the stories have grown up?
Exactly. Well, but having said that, though, when you were writing Roadmap, were you surprised by... Did you actually have any of those sort of classical type hauntings that, from modern witnesses, I mean, that you previously thought were just the stuff of legend?
Do you know what really blew my mind when it came to writing Roadmap was the Black Shucks.
Really?
Because in my mind, for anybody who doesn't know who's listening to this, a Black Shuck is a very, very old legend that you get predominantly in the West Country of Britain and in East Anglia. I don't know why those two polar regions, but you do. And they're large black dogs, about the size of a calf, usually described as, often with glowing red eyes, cause all sorts of mayhem in the Middle Ages, medieval times. And they were very often harbingers of doom and so on. They were believed to have some sort of link possibly back to the Viking dogs of war, Ragnarok, that sort of thing. So there was, possibly a sort of mixing together of two sets of myths and religion. And for a while, they were the big ticket item, the black dogs. And they faded out of existence as we hit sort of the 1700s onwards. You hear less and less and less about them. So in my mind, they were an ancient myth, a bit like a dragon or, just an ancient myth, until I was researching for Roadmap and found several people who'd seen one.
Really?
So they appear to still
within our lifetime?
Within our lifetime, yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
So they appear to be alive and well and busily haunting our roads at the moment.
See, that does blow my mind as well, because, I mean, we've researched Black Shucks before, and I was with you. I just thought it was one of those mythical beings where, possibly something happened and they've just assigned this kind of generic form to it of this, beastly black dog. But to think that there's people in this day and age that have experienced that is just crazy.
And then once you realise that you've picked up a couple of modern stories of Black Shucks, and the person that I was interviewing under no terms described these as a Black Shuck, because actually you have to be a bit read up in this field to know about Black Shucks now, because they're just not in common parlance the way they used to be. So unless you happen to have a vested interest in the paranormal and have done quite a bit of reading, most people, I'd venture to suggest, probably haven't heard of them. So the people I was interviewing didn't describe them as a Black Shuck or anything. They just described what they saw. And it was me sitting there thinking, oh my God, they're describing a Black Shuck. And then that led me on to think, and what about all the reports you get in the papers about big cats? So you get the big Black Panther sightings. Now, is that just a case of, so this is where I come back to the whole perception thing.
Yeah.
Is that a case of people are still seeing Black Shucks, but in this modern day and age, they are interpreting them as Black Panthers escaped from zoos and what have you?
Absolutely.
Because that's a knowledge we have easily in front of us these days. Everybody knows what a Black Panther looks like.
Well, this is it. I mean, our generation, we didn't grow up with stories of Black Shucks. We grew up with newspaper reports of people, big cats escaped from zoos being sighted on Dartmoor. So
but they could never find what zoo it had escaped from.
And they could never find the animal.
No, and then they wondered if somebody had had one in a private collection that had escaped. And that's what makes me think, well, are these actually just the modern day Black Shucks?
Yeah.
We're giving a different description because people know what a Black Panther looks like. So they're seeing this large black animal and assigning it to, well, I mean, that must be, it's something like a panther that I saw, or, they know that there's, big cats exist, in the modern day and age when we have books and television and computer and everything. We all know about African animals and South African, and all the rest of it. In the medieval times, they didn't know what animals were elsewhere in the world because, the written word wasn't readily available to the common man. You'd get the pamphlet type things that went out that everybody was absolutely fascinated to, have one in the village that somebody would read out to people. So the story of something like a Black Shuck, once promulgated, was as fast as anything was going to travel in people's conscious at that time.
Definitely.
And is that just a case of it's actually the same phenomena, just over the centuries, getting a different, I don't know, but definitely there are a couple of Black Shucks live and kicking in the roadmap of British
and
ghosts.
was that in the East Midlands or where they're classically known to haunt?
One was, one wasn't.
Okay. Well,
So,
just to throw a spanner in the works.
Just to, they're busy roaming wherever they fancy it. Seems to me. But, it all comes back to the more research I do on this and the more I gather people's stories, the more I think there are actually different phenomena.
Yeah.
And there is not going to be one explanation fits all, because I don't see how you can answer, for example, the lady seeing the entity crossing the road. That is clearly not the ghost of a person.
No.
Mm-hmm.
There is nothing about that description is a person. The Black Shucks, they're not people.
No.
So they're clearly not spirits of deceased people. And yet others seem to very clearly give that, you know, especially some of the roadside ghosts that you get in the book of, you know, people seen crossing the road looking perfectly ordinary in broad daylight. And the only reason the person realised they were seeing something paranormal was that as they idly watched the person step up onto the roadside, you know, onto the curbside on the opposite side of the road, the person disappeared.
Well, this is something we've often said, isn't it? You know, a lot of the phenomena that we've seen would have looked perfectly ordinary, and the only reason you're alerted to the fact that it's something paranormal is because, for example, one of my personal experiences happened in my house, so I knew there shouldn't be a person there. But if that had happened in a public building, I wouldn't have ever thought that that was a ghost.
No.
I just would have assumed it was a person. So when we're driving around Britain's roads, how many times are we really seeing ghosts? And we just don't even know.
Well, not even driving, you know, makes you wonder if you're walking down a town high street, whether, you know, somebody that you see is
really there.
I would love to have the time and the resources to one day sit with any given historic city's CCTV cameras.
Yes.
And just plough through them.
Yeah.
You know, through the night. The footage, I mean, you know, of a couple of nights, and just watch what is actually captured of what looks like normal people, and then suddenly aren't there or whatever. Because I suspect there's probably more of that, because nobody watches the footage because they've got no need to.
No.
That probably, you know, we realise. I mean, there's certainly one story in Roadmap where the chap was driving home. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning in South Wales, and he saw a young lady, young girl walking down the road towards his car. Looked to be in her sort of late teens, maybe early 20s. Looked like she was coming home from a nightclub, so dressed accordingly in quite skimpy clothing. And it kind of caught his eye, because she was on her own, which obviously in this day and age, as women, we tend to be a bit more cautious about walking around very late at night on our own in skimpy clothing. So that sort of caught his eye. But B, because it was winter and she wasn't wearing a coat. And that made him sort of take a second glance, because it occurred to him, I wonder if she's all right. You know, why is she, A, out walking on her own at this time, dressed like that? And B, if she hasn't got a coat, does that mean is she in some sort of trouble? Is she fleeing or, you know, or whatever? So he turned his head to actually look properly at her as he drove past to see if he could, you know, see any signs of distress, whatever. Just as she turned off the street and into the cemetery that she walked past, at that point he realised he couldn't see the lower part of her legs.
Oh.
That actually he was not looking at a real person.
Oh my goodness. And she was walking into a cemetery?
Yep.
Oh, that gave me the goosebumps.
And it was just one of those where he was just driving along, wasn't thinking about ghosts, wasn't looking for ghosts, was just on his way home, genuinely thought he was looking at an ordinary living human.
And if that had happened in the middle of the day, he wouldn't have had any cause to take a second look, because he wouldn't have had that concern. Or
if the grass had been slightly longer and therefore concealing her lower legs, he would, even though it was odd to see her late at night, he said, you know, he had practically made the decision not to stop because she didn't look distressed or anything, and, you know, and you're not going to stop as a lone male and ask a lone female if she's okay, because you might actually cause more of a problem than you were trying to help with, you know. So had anything been obscuring the lower view of her legs from where he was, to this day he would still be thinking he'd seen just a girl walking home a bit.
See, those stories just absolutely fascinate me.
All stories fascinate me, but yeah, those are an interesting recurring. Again, it's another one of those things where you blink and you miss them.
Yeah.
If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you'd miss them. And well, I saw my mum's legs Like mine was the other way round. I saw the bottom of her legs and not the top of her walking down the stairs one day when she wasn't in. But she's alive as well, so this is another one of those things where I think, am I seeing something that's happened previously?
What made you sure that it was your mum's legs, out of curiosity?
Well, it was her house.
It was her house, and they just looked like my mum's legs. Well,
your mum's quite petite, isn't she?
Yeah, she's quite.
There's a particular stature involved.
But yeah, they just looked like my mum's legs. It was very strange, but no.
But no head, no body.
No. It's sort of from under the knee down.
But oddly enough, that's not the only. We had a listener write in later, didn't we?
Yeah.
That saw, again, not the same thing because it wasn't your mum's legs, obviously, but saw a pair of disembodied legs, which is just something I've never heard of before. These two.
There's in the roadmap. There's somebody saw not the actual legs, but leaves being kicked up by feet that were swirling round, and you could tell that it was a pair of legs they were swirling round.
Oh, that's really weird.
So that's like even more one step further gone, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because I do sometimes wonder as well with some phenomena, particularly the more classic, if you like, ghost apparition of an actual figure. You can find some correlations where the figure is clearly fading over time.
Really?
So earlier stories of it are very definite.
Yeah.
It's a lady wearing a brown dress or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But later correlations that I found, it's now just a vaguely female misty form.
See, that is really interesting because it's not a bugbear exactly, I suppose, but one of the things that's always bothered me is we have Roman ghosts. We know we have stories of Roman ghosts, but not much. Well, nothing really. We don't have stories of ghosts pre-Roman.
Beg to differ.
Oh, do tell.
Go and read roadmap again.
There's obviously one that I missed. Tell me.
Our oldest ghost that we know of, so I'm told, in the British Isles is, now where on earth is he? He's on one of the barrows, or I'd have to read it myself to remember which one. But he looks like an Iron Age warrior on the horse.
I will sort of go through the book again with fine-tooth comb to find this story.
But we have got an Iron Age warrior, and we've also got what looks like might be a druid standing outside another one of the.
You've made my day. I've been searching for a pre-Roman ghost story for so long, and I didn't think there were any sightings. So that is really unusual. And were they modern sightings, or are these from years and years ago?
They're within the last century.
See, that is
so. Yes, so modern enough.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because what I was going to say, and you kind of blow that out of the water in a way, but what I was going to say was the Roman ghost sightings just seem to have tailed off almost. I want to say quite sharply. I don't know of that many sightings. There are so many historically, but in recent years they seem to have tailed off, which kind of led me to wonder, are they fading over time? Is it, as we progress in history, are the oldest ghosts sort of fading away? And that's why, there's been the sightings of Roman ghosts has suddenly tailed off because it's so long ago now. And is that going to get more and more so as we move forward? And then will, the headless horsemen suddenly start disappearing and not making themselves known anymore? Because, do you know what I mean?
Does the phenomenon cycle down over time?
Yeah. Throw some speculation in here.
Sure.
In that you've obviously got sort of the stone tape theory where a lot of these things are recordings of something that's happened and you don't sort of interact, and it's like a videotape, it's just replaying again. And that's somehow recorded in the environment, stone tape, it's sort of often said to be stone.
Yeah.
With things like Roman buildings, a lot of them now are underground, the ones that do survive, and the ones that haven't have been torn down and turned into other buildings and spread out and what have you. So is it the fact that you've effectively taken your tape and chopped it up into lots of tiny little bits and spread it all over the area to remake new buildings which have then been demolished, and that's what's dissipated your previous ghosts? Because you've got the one that we talked about previously, the Treasurer's House in York, and when they excavated under the basement, they started seeing Roman figures, and that was because that archaeology was still there in situ. And if they hadn't excavated, that would have still been going on underground.
And the same happened when they excavated to build the A34 near Newbury.
Okay.
So they excavated, that's a large dual carriageway that they were excavating to put in. And they disturbed Roman remains. And there was a whole spate of Roman ghost sightings immediately afterwards.
But then, so do those sightings then dissipate once those artifacts have been taken away? Because I can understand how, like, if you disturb, a burial mound or some artifacts, and the experiences will kick off. People will see these Roman ghosts all over the place, but then that fades, doesn't it? So does the fact that you've taken away those artifacts sort of dissipate the effect after a while?
Well, it's a working theory to see whether or not it correlates. I mean, somebody did facetiously ask me, because I do a lot of my research by going out on social media, and I get a lot of very strange answers sometimes from some unpleasant individuals sometimes. Oh. But one person facetiously asked me, and I had to quite chuckle, if there's such thing as ghosts, why don't we see dinosaur ghosts? To which I smugly answered, the Loch Ness Monster, ? Because who's to say those sightings aren't the ghost of a dinosaur? Yet we have no physical evidence of it, and yet people keep on seeing it.
They do, yeah.
Although that reminds me, somebody this week has come out and said they found DNA evidence as to what it actually is in the water.
And I think it's giant eels or something now, don't they?
Yes, I must have a read of that.
Really sizable giant eel.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so that was my answer. That is, perhaps this is where some of the lake monsters that we have, perhaps they're not lake monsters, perhaps they're ghosts of dinosaurs.
And that's, I suppose, that kind of would tie into the theory of do ghosts fade over time, though, because when you think about the time scale, prehistoric, dinosaurs, prehistoric creatures, things like that. I mean, it's beyond comprehension how long ago that was, really.
And plus what we were saying, with the Roman stuff, you're unearthing archaeology that sometimes can be 10 or 20 feet underground, and that's within recorded history.
Yeah.
With dinosaurs, you're talking time when continents were in different places.
Exactly.
There's no guarantee that even if they were trotting about where they were, that's not under the ocean or under 150 feet of earth, or God knows.
Well, also, the other thing that always fascinates me about Roman ghosts is a lot of our roads still do run along Roman roads.
Yeah.
So even where you've got a road where you've excavated and you've removed Roman artifacts, what you've got, you're still creating a channel of energy that's basically treading the same path that Roman soldiers trod before. So you're almost maintaining that energy of what once went on there. So does that sort of, I've got to wonder if that plays into it somehow when we're walking the same paths as our ancestors. Does that make the phenomenon more likely to continue over time?
Again, it's a good working theory and interesting to think. I come back to gather data.
Yep.
That's how at some point somebody will be able to put these correlations together and actually find some of the answers, if not all of the answers. But without the data, you're on a hiding to nothing, aren't you? And that's why I do so much research and trying to talk to people for their own stories. And I interview so many people and I get their own versions of what's happened. I start with a base story, often one that's been published somewhere else, that I found already recorded. And then I look for the correlations and see if I can find anybody else who's experienced something in that area.
And that is really refreshing about Roadmap, that you've got new stories as well, because, and we've said this on the show before, it is frustrating sometimes when you're researching an area and you're just coming across the same one story regurgitated over and over again.
Now, we've talked a lot about other people's experiences that you've recorded. What kicked off your interest in people's experiences?
What is your paranormal origin story?
My earliest memory of something paranormal, I must have been very little, maybe 4 or 5 years old, possibly about 4, I think. And I'm thinking I must have been that old because my sister and I were put together, bed together in the same bed on this particular night, which you tend to do with very small children, don't you? So we had gone to stay with friends of our parents somewhere in Shropshire. I'm thinking it was somewhere in Shropshire because I can remember that we were going back to visit old friends of theirs, and that's where they had lived originally. So in my head, it's always been somewhere in Shropshire, although actually I'm not entirely sure now where it was. When I'm
not surprised if you're only 4, though.
Yeah. But what I remember of going is we went to stay with this couple that were friends of our parents, and they had an old style cottage which had a kitchen cum dining room, with a real fire in it. And then it had a separate lounge that was kept for best. Way
the old-fashioned
done in the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
And it also had a sort of dining cum snug room that, again, wasn't used very much. Might almost be thought of as a parlour.
Mm.
And what they'd done is they'd pushed the table aside in that room and put down a trussel bed for my sister and I to sleep on. Obviously says they could put us in a separate room while the adults carried on with their evening away.
Yeah.
And my sister and I were put to bed in this truckle-type bed, sleeping head to toe. And we were absolutely fascinated because the room had a real fire in it, which was lit and was just dying down to embers, and it had a guard in front of it. And we didn't have real fires in our house at home. So we'd never, ever been in a room with a real fire like this. And we were desperately trying to stay awake to watch the embers die down. When the door opened slightly and 2 grey kittens came into the room, and we were just delighted beyond belief because we weren't allowed pets at home at that point in our lives. So we hadn't got any animals at home. And we were just thrilled that these 2 kittens had come into the room, and they jumped up onto the bed and played with us for quite some time as we got sleepier and sleepier. But the thing that my sister and I remember quite clearly about these kittens was that they kept jumping over each other and writhing round each other like wisps of smoke.
Mm.
So one would jump and the other would go to jump over it, and as they jumped they'd sort of trail off into smoke and then reappear as kittens at the end of the trajectory, if you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So that at all times they were never quite a full cat. It was always starting as a cat and then a cat fading into smoke and then a cat again as it landed. But because we were little, we didn't really pay much attention to that aspect of it.
You don't question stuff like that when you're that young.
We were just so thrilled to have them on the bed, and we didn't dare tell any adults that they were there because they might take them away. And we fell asleep with the kittens playing round on us. And we both clearly remember it. My sister and I even now talk about the weird way they kind of morphed as they jumped. And had that been the end of the story, I would probably, be now in my adult years saying it was probably a childish memory that is misremembered or whatever. But I distinctly remember the following morning sitting in the kitchen area while the lady was making us our breakfast. And I was particularly pleased because I was being allowed cereal with warm milk in it, which Mum would never allow us that. And the milk was being poured out of an old-fashioned jug with blue and white stripes around it, like a really old-fashioned ceramic jug. And I said to the lady, "Can we play with the kittens today?" And she said, "What kittens, dear? I've only got this big fat ginger Tom that was asleep on the chair and was elderly." And I said, no, the 2 grey kittens that came into play last night. And she stopped and turned to my mum and said, "I haven't got kittens, but I did have. They died a couple of years ago."
Oh.
And I remember her saying that. So I knew then that they hadn't been real kittens that we'd seen. And that stuck with me always. That wasn't just a child falling asleep and having, a weird dream and then telling the sister about it. And the sister remembers it as if it was memory. Because you're so little, things become mixed up as to what was memory and what wasn't, doesn't it? But I so distinctly remember her saying that she didn't have the kittens. They died. They'd been killed a couple of years earlier.
Oh, wow. Oh, that gives me the goosebumps.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you wouldn't if you were there. They were lovely.
No, not in a scary way, to be honest.
Yeah.
You've seen a ghost cat as well, haven't you?
Yeah, there's been a couple of times.
Yeah.
We've lost a few cats now, and there's quite a few times where I'll see what I think is a cat walk in the kitchen or brush past my leg, and then you'll find that the rest, they're just sleeping on the sofa and they can't have moved.
Yeah.
But the way you saw them sort of curl around each other like smoke, and I wonder whether, again, because you were so young and your sort of young mind didn't think to question that, I wonder if you'd seen that as an adult, you would have seen it the same way.
I have seen it once as an adult.
Have you?
Yeah. This was about, I'm trying to remember when we got rid of our white Land Rover. Must be at least 10 years ago. We had a white left-hand drive Land Rover Discovery. Mm-hmm. And on our front driveway, if you park the vehicle nose into the garage, then the left-hand side is against a brick wall.
Oh, okay.
So this particular day, so it must have been, say, 10, 12 years ago, something like that. This particular day, I'd come out of the house carrying something that I was going to take somewhere. I've forget what it was, but it was in my arms. So I was using both arms to carry whatever it was in front of me. And I sidled down the side of the Land Rover between the Land Rover and this brick wall because it was left-hand drive and I was obviously getting in the driver's seat. And I was trying to flick open the handle of the driver's door without dropping what I was holding. So I was I realise I'm doing this and we haven't got a camera here. So I was trying to hold my hand out and try and hook it under the edge of the handle to just flick the handle to make it open without letting go of the things I was holding in my arms. When a cat startled out from underneath, we don't own cats, but we've got dogs. No. Startled out from underneath the Land Rover and shot between my legs. Now, as you know, cats often sleep under vehicles, don't they? So nothing was odd about the fact that there would be a cat under the Land Rover. A lot of our neighbours have got cats. But because of the positioning of the vehicle and the brick wall, I was only able to take half a step backwards before hitting the wall. So the cat ran between my legs in me startling it out from under the car and brushed against both legs because I could only take a half step. So my legs weren't very far apart, if you see what I mean. So at that point, it was a physical cat.
Yeah, because you felt it.
I saw it, I felt it. It ran down the vehicle towards the street, and we live on a country lane, but nevertheless, there is traffic on there. So my first thought was, don't run out into the road, you'll get run over. So I turned to watch it run, wondering sort of for a split second, what do I do? Yeah. How do I stop it? And as I turned to watch it run, it went from running perfectly solid cat and just morphed into smoke that disappeared before it got as far as the road. And just a few weeks earlier, our next door neighbour's small black cat had been run over out there. So I suspect it was the ghost of that cat, is what I've always suspected.
But then you sometimes hear about that happening with other, like, people ghosts, in that they seem solid or they seem to be in a particular shape and then dissipate and fade.
It's not something I don't think I've seen that personally. I've seen disembodied smoke that sort of pops up out of nowhere, has no source, has no reason, just kind of embodies itself and then disappears. But seeing something turn from so solid and being able to feel it as well. And then...
Well, at that first moment, I had absolutely, with broad daylight, I hadn't been thinking about ghosts, doing anything to it. I had no reason to assume it was anything other than a real cat at that moment. It was only because I turned to watch it run and it morphed into smoke and disappeared that you're left standing there thinking, okay. Can't quite explain that one then. We'll chalk that down as not right. But, had I not turned to look, and when you think of the millions of little things that could have happened at that moment, in startling, I could have dropped one of the things I carried and bent down to pick that up. How many times do things like that happen? But because the person doesn't happen to turn to look, they don't see.
There are so many variables that need to line up for you to realise that it was something different.
Like the chap with the lady walking into the cemetery. Yeah. If there'd been anything blocking his view, he would never have realised it was a ghost he was looking at, or an apparition, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Because you it's those rare occasions where you see the beginning and the end that you suddenly think, hang on. Until, of course, what really, really sparked my interest is when you move into a house and have a full-blown live poltergeist living with you.
Do tell.
Happily moves everything all the time. And we lived in that house for maybe 7 or 8 years, something like that.
Was this an old house or a modern house?
It wasn't modern, but neither was it really old. So I must admit, I've never looked into the history of it or anything, so I would be guessing it was maybe turn of the century, so maybe 1900s or something. It was in Hertfordshire, and it was in a cul-de-sac of houses. It was probably the oldest house on the or one of the two oldest houses on the cul-de-sac, and it looked like it might originally have been maybe a farmhouse or something. It might not even be quite that old, but it was older than some of the others on the cul-de-sac anyway. But it was quite a big property, from my parents' property, because it had a granny flat, as they're called, attached to it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But rather than being a flat, this was actually a 2 up, 2 down, 2-bedroomed house attached to the side. So the whole building, the main end had 3 bedrooms, bathroom, downstairs loo, huge lounge diner, smallish kitchen, utility room, big hallway. The granny flat end of the house had 2 bedrooms, upstairs bathroom, downstairs shower and toilet room, and a large lounge and a kitchen and a hallway. And the 2 properties were interlinked by an interlinking door on the ground floor and an interlinking door on the first floor from the master bedroom of the big house onto the upstairs landing of the smaller house.
Mm-hmm.
And our grandparents moved in with us when we bought it. They'd moved with us from our previous property. Their end of the house was often standing empty because at that point in their lives they did a lot of travelling abroad. So very often they weren't home. And for some reason, almost as soon as we moved in, my parents ripped out the family bathroom in our side of the house, intending to renovate it and do it up. But for whatever reason, I never did ask. They never got round to doing it. So we never had a family bathroom in our side of the house.
Oh.
So we all used the family bathroom in Nana's side of the house, which was upstairs. And Nan and Grandad used the shower and toilet room that was downstairs in their side of the house. So to use the family bathroom, you used to have to go through my parents' bedroom and out through the connecting door onto Nana's landing to the bathroom.
Mm.
And my sister, who's older than myself, started refusing to go and have a bath on her own because she said every time she went in there, somebody would bang on the door and frighten her. I was absolutely convinced this was our younger brother and was just telling her absolute nonsense, It's not him, it's something in the house doing it. So eventually I agreed to go with her, only because she nagged me endlessly.
Sisters are like that.
Yeah, she'll probably listen to this. I did not. But she did. She nagged me endlessly until I went and sat with her one night while she had a bath. So picture the scene. She's in the bath. I'm sitting on the toilet with the lid down.
Mm-hmm.
We're quietly chatting. When somebody came and hammered on that door so badly that the entire door was shaking in its frame and making the frame round it and everything rattle. And they were literally pounding on it with both fists, it sounded like. My sister started to scream, started to speak to me. I instantly shushed her because I was absolutely certain this was my younger brother, playing tricks on her. And I knew that he didn't know I was in there with her. So I was blooming well going to have him for this. So whilst the door was still being pounded on and the handle was going berserk as if somebody was violently twisting it, while that was all happening, I snuck up to the door and flung it open to confront him, only to find there was nobody there.
I've got to say you're braver than me. If somebody was hammering on the door, I think I'd have chickened out.
I just assumed it was my flesh and blood younger brother.
Yeah,
it never occurred to me that it was anything but that. My sister kept saying it was something other, but I was absolutely convinced she was wrong and that it was our brother was just playing tricks on it. So I was absolutely certain I was going to fling the door open and punch him in the face for frightening her to death, making me have to go and sit in the bathroom with her. So it was a horrible, horrible revelation to fling that door open and be confronted with nothing.
So did that happen to any of the other family members? Did anybody else experience things?
Not in lots of things happened, but the bathroom thing was just her. So strange. The thing that used to happen a lot was things would move a lot.
Yeah.
So for example, there's just too many we'd be here all night if I told you another.
We could definitely revisit this another time.
Yes, we can. Yeah. But I'll just give you one more of a really strong example.
Yeah, please.
My mother and I were in the kitchen at tea time. So we had tea around about 5:30, so it'd be about 6:00 in the evening.
Yeah.
And it was daylight and she had the radio on and she and I were chatting while we cleared up the tea things. Must have been my turn or whatever. And so that if you picture the scene, that we had a table that pulled out into the middle of the room where us kids used to sit round to eat our tea after school. So on that are all the things from tea. And we used to have, for our tea, we used to have like sandwiches and salad type tea.
Sort of traditional tea.
Yeah, because we'd had school dinner.
Yeah.
So we didn't have a cooked meal in the evening because we would have had school dinner.
High tea.
Yeah, so there would be, like sandwiches, bit of salad maybe, that kind of thing, sandwich spread, jam, that kind of thing on the table. So we're clearing the table and thrown on the table was a tea towel.
Yeah.
Like a drying cloth, just thrown on the table, slightly screwed up. We're busy lifting the plates and putting them in the sink and what have you and chatting away. When this tea towel flattened itself out from the crumpled ball it was in, carefully folded itself one way, then folded itself in the opposite direction second way, and then folded itself back in the original direction. third time.
With everybody watching.
With my mum and I stood there watching it. So it formed a perfect folded tea towel. And we both stood there and watched it and looked at each other and looked at the tea towel. Okay.
How do you even respond to that?
Exactly. How do you respond?
How do you react?
It's not even, honestly, you'd think you'd run screaming from the room. What? But it's so bizarre.
It's so
that you just stand there going,
I think at this point I'd be like, awesome, thank you. There's another pile over there.
Yeah. Tempting. But we will have to revisit that at some point. There are literally dozens of things that used to go on in that house.
We definitely need to talk more about that another time.
It does bring up an interesting point in that we've both had a lot of experiences throughout our lives, and it sounds like you've certainly had more than one encounter, and yet you tend to find a lot of people report they've had just this one experience and it stuck with them. It was spooky or exciting or scary or what have you. Is there a difference you found between that sort of person when they report a story, and trying to think of the best way of explaining it? That you do come across people that have experience after experience after experience.
More than their fair share, one would think.
And I would say that we would have more than our fair share of experiences.
But then we kind of chase it. We go after
we
it.
We look for it.
But you're right in that you get people that they're not necessarily chasing it. They're not paranormal investigators. They're not, researching it. They just do tend to attract it.
What I tend to find is that the people who have more experiences, and I am generalising, the people who tend to have more experiences are the ones who develop an interest in the subject.
Okay.
And this is where I come back to that original quote of, the more you look into the paranormal, the more it will look back at you.
Yeah.
And whatever your stance, so if somebody decides that they've had an experience, so that must mean they're a medium, or it must mean they have psychic ability, they get interested in that, whichever branch or arm or field it is that sparks their interest, and they pay more attention and get more involved in that. So they might, for instance, join a spiritualist church and get more interested in that teaching, or they might start looking into mediumistic type things, or they might start looking into tarot cards and future reading, or whatever it might be that spark their interest, and they go down a pathway perhaps. Or like yourselves, like myself, we get interested into the investigative side of it and we become paranormal investigators or data collectors, writers, whatever. Those people then tend to have more experiences because I think they're actively looking for them in one way or another.
Perhaps even if they're not directly out searching for them,
but they're opening
subconsciously
themselves to them, aren't
looking for more things to happen. Yeah.
But your average person who doesn't spark an interest in themselves in it tends to have fewer experiences, because what seems to happen quite a lot then is that they have the one experience and it scares them so badly they kind of shut their minds down to it.
Right.
So I don't want to ever have to see that again. I don't want to ever have to experience that again, is what I hear a lot.
Yeah.
I do get some where people hover in between those two categories, which is why I say I'm generalising, because I do get some where people seem to have the occasional thing throughout their life. They never spark a big interest in it, so they never become actively interested in the field in any particular way. But at the same time, they don't shut down completely and become absolutely terrified by it. So they do end up having some experiences.
That's really interesting, though. We laugh between ourselves quite a lot because obviously we ask a lot of people if they've had any experiences.
If you're about to say what you're about to say, I was thinking exactly the same thing.
And so many times when we ask people if they've had any paranormal experiences, we've said this on the show before, sorry to repeat it again, but what we get is, oh no, I don't believe in any of that stuff, but... And then they proceed to tell you.
Get a corker of a story out of them.
But that makes perfect sense with what you're saying. They've had some, this incredible, unbelievable experience. But the reason, and from our point of view, we can't understand why they're prefacing that with, I don't believe in any of that stuff, because clearly this incredible thing has happened to them. But you're right, perhaps that's because it scared them. They actually don't want to know any more about that. And they kind of, that's their way of saying, yes, it happened, but actually I don't want anything to do with it.
And keeping it at arm's length, absolutely. And interestingly, to circle back round, the lady who saw the entity that crossed the road,
right,
her husband will not talk about it to this day.
Oh.
She told me.
Okay.
So she remembers it. She will talk about it. He prefers not to remember that night and not to talk about it because he can't explain what they saw. And he doesn't like to have to think about it or anything.
No.
So, and I absolutely get exactly the same as you. I get asked all the time, oh, what do you write about if people realise I'm an author? And people say, oh, I don't believe in that when I say ghosts. I don't believe in that.
Yeah.
Mind you.
Yeah.
There's this one odd, and there's the but, And honestly, if I had to quantify that, I think something like 95% of people have at least one small occurrence that's happened. Because very rarely do I engage with somebody who says, no, nothing ever, nothing at all, nothing, never ever, nothing. Usually people have got there's one thing, and it's not necessarily a ghostly type thing, but they've usually had some sort of phenomena they can't actually explain.
And I'm constantly surprised by just how many people that is true of. So Ruth, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk with us today. I feel like we could talk for hours and hours about this fascinating subject, but we won't keep you too much longer. But we are quite excited that you do have a new book in the works. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and when we might be able to expect that?
I do, yes. The new book will be called These Haunted Times, and that's an exclusive, boys and girls.
You heard it here first.
You heard it here first. Probably, hopefully, These Haunted Times Volume 1. I'm hoping, if I'm a good girl and pull my finger out, to have it out by Christmas.
Cool.
And essentially, this one came about because the other three, I'd been collecting data for some years before actually putting them together and getting around to writing the books. And then having collected the data and then gone out on social media to look for the correlation stories to go in with them.
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of people answered those queries with, well, I haven't seen the ghost along the A421 that you're asking about, but my house that's near there has got a ghost in it.
Oh.
And they would go on to tell me a bit about that story, which was absolutely great. But of course, it didn't fit into the theme, of either of the other books I was writing at the time. So I parked them into the, my huge database of paranormal with the thought, I'll circle back round to them. So having published Roadmap, I was itching to start. I'm terrible. The minute I've published one, I think, great, I'll take some time off. No, I won't. 2 days later, I'm busily sitting in front of the computer again. So I did circle back round and sort of have a look if I got anything there I can, begin to look into. And I was actually quite surprised when I pulled it all together into like a skeleton layout. As the start of a book is the way I do it is I lay it out like a skeleton format. And I thought, actually, there's enough here for at least one volume, possibly two.
Oh, wow.
So I'm now in the rounds of, there's my source story, which this time, instead of being a previously published story that somebody else had published that I'm now researching, these are private stories that people have given me. So I'm now in the process of researching to see if anybody else has had anything in those same locations. Right. Again, the same theory.
So we're starting off with a witness within our lifetime, but you're still doing the you can't turn off the analytical brain. You're still trying to find the correlating. That's cool. And I'm
already finding the correlations, which is absolutely great. So,
fab.
You find one witness who. It's a little bit difficult because a lot of these in this book are in private residences.
Okay, yeah.
Whereas before I was talking about generally more historic residences or roads.
Yeah.
So I'm having to be a bit careful when I go out on social media because I don't really want to say, oh, does anybody know about the ghost in number 32 High Street?
No.
And the poor person who's currently living at number 32 High Street thinking, what? What ghost?
What's this about a ghost in my house?
So I'm having to be a bit circumspect about not giving away the actual address because I don't think that would be fair on individuals. And that in itself is bringing out some fascinating correlations because I'm not giving a specific address, but I'm saying, a street or, a building along this road or whatever. People are coming up, but actually it's like 4 doors down or the pub opposite where I'm looking for. And I'm starting to think, well, now I'm picking up correlations of surrounding buildings, which again brings the question, are these phenomena, hauntings, whatever you want to call them, are they occurring on a patch of ground rather than a specific building?
Yeah.
And it just happens to be whatever building's got built on that patch of ground, get the haunting.
Yeah, exactly. So rather than
picked the lucky spot.
Yeah. So almost on a route rather than in a specific place.
Yeah. But yes, back we go again with the endlessly fascinating. And here are the correlations coming.
Oh, I can't wait to see what that looks like.
Reading,
yeah, it does. No, that's really. I shall look forward to that.
So
definitely.
Christmas present list.
Yeah, put that on our Christmas list.
Dear Santa.
I might need to talk to you a bit nearer the time as well. So you're getting on. So for anybody that wants to read the books that are already published, you've got 3 out there already. Where can they get hold of those?
They're all published via Amazon. Mm-hmm. So the most obvious place to go to is to Amazon if you've got an Amazon account. They're available as a Kindle ebook. If you've got a Kindle Unlimited subscription, you can read them for free, or you can have them in paperback. But they are also now sourceable through most good bookshops.
Cool.
And quite a lot of the online bookstores of varying names and descriptions are stocking them now. And they are also now on the distribution list. So you should be able to ask a bookstock to pull them off the distribution list and stock them.
Excellent. And if you're local, you also do quite a lot of author talks, don't you? Because that's where we first met you. So keep an eye on Ruth's social media page for any events. For if you're in our local area, you might be able to go and pick up the books in person.
Absolutely. I'm always happy to come and do talks.
Where can people find your social media pages to follow you?
Just simply just Google my name, Ruth Roper Wylde, spelt the way I spell it, which will be in the podcast title.
It will, yeah.
Just Google that and it'll pick you up, all the social media and everything, because it's quite an unusual name, so it only picks me up, so that's okay.
Cool. So, and we'll put all the links to your Amazon page on our show notes as well.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. It's been absolutely fascinating. I think we're going to have another talk sometime in the near future.
Definitely. Always happy to come back and talk ghosts.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the wonderful Ruth Roper Wylde. We hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as we did. Of course, the thing that makes the paranormal world so endlessly intriguing are the mysteries within it. And one of the great things about doing this show is getting the opportunity to sit down with people like Ruth to discuss those mysteries and just see what ideas and theories come out in the conversation. It really is one of the privileges of podcasting. Please do go and check out Ruth's books. The Ghosts of Marston Vale has some great stories, and we found the Roadmap of British Ghosts and the Almanac of British Ghosts to be really useful reference books.
Well, that just about brings us to the end of the show. But before we go, we want to wish you all a very happy Halloween. Regular listeners will know that it's long been a tradition of ours at this special time of year to light candles of remembrance for loved ones who have passed away. And sadly, we have a few more candles to light this year. But we would like you to join us this season in celebrating the lives of the loved ones we've lost. So for Halloween week, we'll be making our Facebook group a board of remembrance where we can all share memories of our loved ones who've passed on. We'll make a remembrance thread in the group where you can share a photo, a memory, a story, or just the name of anyone you'd like to remember this Halloween. So please do head on over to our Facebook group and join us in our celebrations of remembrance if you'd like. And of course, we probably don't need to say it, but that absolutely includes family of the furry, feathery and four-legged variety as well. It can be really painful remembering our loved ones who've passed on, but I tend to find it's never quite as painful when you're with friends.
And that is all we have on today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. A huge thank you to those of you that have shared your stories, and please do get in touch if you have a paranormal story to share. Remember that if you have a haunted hotel story to share with Saloon Media, then get in touch putting Hotel Paranormal in the subject line. There is a contact form and our email address on the website at knockOnceForYes.com. Thank you also to our wonderful patrons whose support allows us to keep making the show, and to Ruth Roper Wylde for joining us to speak about all things spooky. We'll be putting links to Ruth's social media and books in the show notes on the website, so do check out her books and let her know you enjoyed listening to her on the show. On the next episode, we will finally deliver you the Ouija board special we've been promising for so long. It looks like it'll be a jam-packed one, and we're pretty excited about it. Until then, remember to follow the path of weird, and we hope you'll join us next time for another Knock Once for Yes.
EVP session end.